Welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jen.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome back to Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. So this is a bit of an unusual episode for us because this episode is going to feature a full-length live podcast episode that we recorded at the Pedagogy into Practice conference in beautiful Norman, Oklahoma at the University of Oklahoma. I believe it was the end of May, right? It was May 31st or June 1st, one of those 2 days. We had the honor of being able to present a panel discussion on conversations in music theory pedagogy. So kind of recapping the things that we have learned from our conversations and then sharing how we have implemented some of those ideas in our own classroom. And we also got to give a poster as well where we got to highlight some of our guests from outside of music theory and their ideas and opinions and thoughts on what music theory students, or music therapy, music ed, music students that are not music theory students need from music theory. So I had a great time. How did you guys enjoy it?
It was amazing. I came back really inspired and excited to teach, this fall, and it was a great weekend.
It was my first time going to the conference. So I would say that it's the greatest group of people that I've been with in a long time in the field of music theory. Mm-hmm. It's really re-energizing, and it's really inspiring to go to all the talks and the posters, and just even the lunches and dinners were really excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sometimes you go to a conference and you're like, I might skip that one, or you don't have maybe a lot of things that you're really excited about. This is the total opposite. I mean, like, you were sad that you had to decide. It was like a Sophie's choice constantly going on.
I didn't skip a single session. I went to something every session. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it was great. And we're going to, as a summer short, do a little recap of the sessions that we attended, give a lot of shout outs. There were a lot of past guests at this conference. I mean, a lot of honorary note doctors. They abounded. So,
yes.
So it was great. And so look for that summer short in the coming weeks where we recap the other things that we learned, not just our presentation at the conference. So what you're going to hear is our panel, but there are going to be some kind of noticeable cuts where we actually went and asked the audience some questions. And so we thought we would describe a little bit of what that was about, and because that doesn't really transfer very well to a audio medium. We should have thought better about that, but
it was our first live podcast recording, so
it was. We got off to a slightly bumpy start with microphones, but we once we got past that, we were great.
Yes. So we did rapid fire questions, basically, between each of our three sections. We had a section on diversifying the repertoire in our curriculum and just kind of diversifying the curriculum in general, because those two things go together. Then a section on oral skills, and we closed with a section on more kind of curricular change, like how you change the bigger picture, the structures, all of those things. And for each set, we had some rapid fire questions for the audience. So, but you cannot hear what's happening on the poll. So I think they can go to notedoctorspodcast.com and see the polls, though.
Indeed you can. Yes, so we had them do poll everywhere polls with their phones, and so they were able to answer their questions from the seats. And I think we have about 12 questions, including the classic 164, 564, or CAD 64. We had to include that one. And you can see how our audience of, 50 or so folks answered those questions. And so they're really insightful. And if you're like one of the the participants wanted to use that information to show your admin why you should do a certain thing pedagogically, you're welcome to use those polls to bolster your argument. Any of those polls, as you're thinking back, surprising to you? I know it was like 3 days ago since we did it. We're recording it now, but it feels like about a week. Anything either of you guys recall?
Yeah. So the none being the biggest textbook. Ben
so what was
nodding.
the question? What was the question? What was that
What
question?
textbook do you use?
Oh, yeah,
and it was
that's
just kind of a free response. So I'm not sure how. I mean, this is not very particular data because we did it into sort of a word cloud situation. So sometimes it was separating out the words of people's books. So some of the responses probably, if they had been combined, might have looked bigger. But none was far and away the biggest one up there. And I think I asked a follow-up question, like how many of you are supplementing, you've created all your own materials or you're kind of piecing things together. And most people, it seems, had created all of their own materials. So that's a huge task.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing. The fact that when we asked people what textbook they're using, the biggest or number one answer in the word cloud was none. And even those that were using textbooks said that a significant percentage, whether it was 25, 50, or 75, but it wasn't zero. Examples that they're teaching are supplementary from other materials, YouTube, collections from different books from, for example, ethnomusicologies or music anthropologies. So it's really cool to see. It was really cool to see those poll results and tap into all the people that were in the room and what they're doing in their teaching.
Yeah, that seems like that should be a future episode topic where we talk to people who have gone completely textbookless. Well, actually, Ben, you don't have a textbook, right?
I do not have a textbook. I use literature alone. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that could be a good summer short where you explain how on earth you figured out how to get 60 weeks of material, because we're talking theory 1 through 4, right?
Yep.
Yeah, 60 weeks of material, examples, assignments, all without a textbook. That just gives me heart palpitations just thinking about it.
I'll give you a hint. Composers of Color Resource Project.
All right. That's
It's a great resource. I did help work on it, so it's a little bit of self-promotion, but I didn't work on it nearly as much as other people, so really I'm promoting other people's work. So check out Composers of Color Resource Project if you haven't already. It's absolutely fantastic. I've contributed also some helpful handouts and analysis examples that are on there for some of the pieces, and it's all curated by S&T theorists. It's really fantastic.
That's a great plug. So it's a really great resource, and maybe something we could talk about, kind of walk us through, what the process was. Obviously, you didn't go from no book or one book to no book within 24 hours, but I think a lot of folks are interested in that option, whether going to no book completely or open resources and things like that. And so, yeah, that was definitely a surprising answer, I think, from one of the polls. But there are many other polls that you can check out on notedoctorspodcast.com. You'll find a link on the homepage by the time this is out. So I hope you all enjoy hearing our conversation from pedagogy into practice. It was a great conference. It's going to be happening in another 2 years. So if you've never been, please check it out. It's such a wonderful community. I mean, Ben, you mentioned it. Like the people are so great. Everyone there is for learning. They're for improving as a teacher, and they're just fun folks. Like we met some people that we were like, oh my gosh, we're meeting them, and they were like so awesome and down to earth. Like we were like, oh my gosh, yeah. And so, did you just say it, Jen? I was giving you a surprise.
No, I said totally. Oh, I said I was agreeing with you. I didn't give it away.
Yeah, so we were a little starstruck at a couple folks, but they turned out to be just totally awesome, totally normal, and that's one of the great things about that conference is just how you're able to kind of rub shoulders with some of the great teachers in our profession and learn from them, and they're all very gracious and humble and wanting to help.
Yeah.
Thank you. And welcome to Note Doctors, the Music Theory and Pedagogy podcast. My name is Paul.
My name is Jen.
We practice this. We really practice this. That's how it starts every time. We knew it was going to mess up.
Perhaps the funniest element is that the first time we recorded it, I just didn't say my name.
Here, hold it.
Tried.
You got to hold it down.
Okay, go again.
My name is Paul.
My name is Jen.
And my name is Ben.
We're your hosts. So you might wonder why it looks like we have just finished a basketball game and at a press conference, but we're actually recording this conversation live, so hopefully it'll be up as a podcast in the next week or two, so that's why we have extra microphones going on right into here. And so we want to talk a little bit about the podcast and what we have done, if you want to learn more. And so we have some facts here. So this project started because of the pandemic. So we three all teach theory in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we often would collaborate, and I would often have Jen and Ben come to my theory pedagogy class that I would teach for graduate students and talk about their experiences and their strategies. And then when everything went online, I was teaching it in the summer of 2020, and I had them Zoom into our class, and it was a great conversation. Like, the students were even more lively, and afterwards we were texting each other. I'm like, that was really fun. It was like being on a podcast. And they're like, well, we should be on a podcast because we have nothing else to do in 2020. And so that's how we started. We started off in September of 2020. Jenny Snodgrass was our inaugural guest, so we aimed high. And so since then we have released 76 episodes. You can see some of the stats. We've had 57 different guests. Mostly have been college faculty, from junior faculty to full professors. We've had high school teachers. We've had a YouTuber. We've tried to kind of get as many voices as we can. Focused on theory pedagogy. So niche, it's niche. You can see the number of downloads, so it's been niche, but still people are listening. And so you can see we've had people from all over the globe listen, and it's really humbling and crazy. And currently we're being supported through a grant from my university, the School of the Arts and Design, to help pay for our website and housing of our podcast applications. And so we thought we would kind of first describe our schools a little bit more, because I think that does play a role in the ways that we have implemented many of the ideas that our guests have brought forth. And so I teach at Texas Women's University, which is the largest public university primarily for women. It's actually co-ed, but about 90% of our enrollment identify as female, though within our music program, it's about 75%. Our largest area of study is music therapy, which also plays a big role in what we teach and will play a role in what we talk about with curriculum. So that's a little bit about TWU.
I teach at Dallas Baptist University. It is a small-ish. We have about 5,000 total students. The music department is around 120 students. It is a liberal arts university, and it is a faith-based school. We do not have an instrumental program. We have only basically a choral program. We do have students who play guitar. We have a cellist. We have pianists and such, but we do not have, say, a band or an orchestra. So that impacts my teaching every day, all the time. We also have a large music business program, and that also impacts my teaching every day, all the time.
Now there's me, University of North Texas. I'm in Denton. We are one of the largest public universities for music, so about 1,600 music majors with various career paths, including now commercial music. We had a really generous donor to support commercial music, so we'll be starting that. And of course, the first jazz studies program in the U.S. I'm really proud of that. And what else? I think that's it.
His classes are like 200 people.
Oh, my classes are very large, yes. This whole room would be more than full, actually.
You like to say how you teach the largest theory class in the country.
Yeah, someone told me that once, and I thought, wow, is that really true? I think
We don't
it could
know.
be. I don't know. But yeah, very large class format for my class. Yeah.
And so we've had all these conversations, and part of this podcast has been a little selfish in its motivations because we have learned so much from the guests that we have brought on. And we're going to highlight kind of 3 kind of topics that have been common threads in a lot of the conversations and how we have implemented those ideas into our classroom teaching. And because this is a podcast, we like to do rapid fire questions. We're going to be trying to do some rapid fire questions with you all to get you involved in this conversation as well. So let's go to our first, so expanding the rep, which has been a theme this week. So more than just notes on the page. So I think, Ben, you want to lead us off there?
Sure, I was going to take the lead on this one, and I got worried this morning because I thought, man, I'm not going to contribute anything to this because all the things that I'm going to say have already been said at this conference, and I really appreciate everyone sticking around for this paper because the topics will overlap a lot. So I want to start by just saying that, first of all, I'm not perfect, and every school is different, so things play out in different ways for different people, so I want to acknowledge that. And also, I want to acknowledge that representation is not everything, but it does matter, right? So, the way I think I guess approach representation is that I want to kind of see who I'm representing in the music examples and the way I teach, and think about that representation matters, but it's not the end goal, right? That diversity of styles that just came up in the last session, right, should be right there alongside representation. We also broke down a section on curricular goals. So if you're thinking about curricular goals, hold your thought for the third part of the talk, and we'll refer back to some things I think that are also in the first section. But in terms of representation, taking on its own terms for a second, I have implemented over 50% of music examples in each one of the units of the theory core that are from composers of color. And I've also kind of layered an additional level to that in terms of stylistic diversity, right? For example, including mariachi, jazz, steel pan, hip hop, anime, whatever it is. And one thing that I think we've noticed as a thread throughout our podcast is that these two things are related. Right? When you represent more styles from around the world, you represent more ways of teaching things, right? You run into things that obviously do not fit into what would have been taught in a theory classroom 20 years ago, that was in a theory textbook 20 years ago, right? And then that necessitates and that follows a way of teaching that shows a more way of embracing and making right discussions for things that, in the past, say, would have avoided and would have run across and say, well, that doesn't exactly fit what I talk about in this unit. I'm not going to put that in there, or I'm going to avoid this for X, Y, Z reason, but instead more intentionally including those and making that discussion point of, well, there's this style here that does this, and there's this style here that does this, and connecting that to representation. Another thing that came up in our podcast a lot was the way of talking about examples, and Phil, you just talked about this in your talk as well, so I'm sorry for overlapping a little bit, but making those quality judgments about different styles. Like when you talk about certain ways of doing things, are you saying that this is the way to do it, or is this a way of doing it, right? Or is this the best way of writing, is this the best example of art writing? I mean, I remember my teachers saying that to me, and now I'm thinking like, wow, this is just a different way. Like, I could ask students to do a deceptive cadence that does a certain thing, and I could ask students to do a deceptive cadence that does something else, right? And does certainly different things. And just showing that they're different, not making any assessments of like, this is the best possible way of doing this, or this is the best possible way of doing that. Just showing that there are different ways of doing those, and then they play out in different stylistic ways for different reasons. And that's one thing that's come up across, I don't know how many episodes, probably over 50 of our guests. So wanted to include that too. Including more, I know this is something that Samantha talked about earlier in the conference, including more repertoires from band, orchestra, and choir, but also like I think at UNT of our ensembles, and I think of like our jazz strings ensemble, or I think about different types of commercial music ensembles that are forming every day. And I think we don't want to, focus solely on band, orchestra, and choir, but also we find ourselves in our episodes a lot of times talking about several examples from piano, right? And so we take one step out, maybe we say, okay, we're going to do some more band, we're going to do some more orchestra, we're going to do some more choir, but obviously there are more steps, right? This is a process of representing different ensembles, I think, as well, and different ways of notation, like, we're talking about DAWs, and, when is notation necessary, a lot of things that are flat from the previous session.
So I think for me, the question of expanding the repertoire and the podcast is kind of a chicken or egg situation, because certainly our conversations have absolutely impacted how I teach and what examples I use and what repertoire shows up in my classroom, but also it was something that I was deeply interested in and passionate about before we ever started the podcast, and I think that's probably true of all three of us. There was a day long before the pandemic and long before the podcast ever started where I was teaching a Theory 2 class, and we were listening to a Mozart example, and I looked out at my students, and they looked the way that they look sometimes at 8:30 in the morning in music theory class, which is like completely disengaged and totally bored. And as I looked at them, I thought, okay, there are 10 women in the room, that's it, no men, 10 women, and 4 of the 10 are people of color. And have they ever once in my class seen a face that looks like theirs? And I wasn't sure if they had. And so I thought, okay, well, how do I solve this? Because this is not something where every musical example has necessarily an identity attached to it. Sometimes that's really appropriate, and sometimes you need to look at lots of things and be able to move through a lot of content. So I've instituted something called Song of the Day. So every music theory class that a student takes with me starts with a song of the day. It's often on as they're walking in or right as class starts. That way I'm sure that, first of all, sound is always in my classroom every day, no matter what. They always hear music. And I put information about the music itself and the composer or performer on a slide up on the wall. So as they're coming in, they're seeing a picture of who is performing or who wrote the piece, and there are a set of questions for them to think about while they listen. And sometimes those questions are deeply related to everything we're going to do that day, and sometimes they're not at all. They're just, to get them to engage. And it is my goal always for it to be Theory 2 before that person is a white male. So they do see white men on that screen, but they see white men a lot of times in our textbook and in other examples that we use and things like that. So I want that to be a space where every student in the room has the opportunity to look up and see someone like them that makes music and that is being highlighted as important in the work we do in our class. And in doing that, it's opened up all of these incredible conversations that we have had about timbre, about texture, about rhythm, more than just chapter 2, or 4 or whatever, about things that they hear in how it was produced or how it was recorded, or if you were in Stacy's keynote, it was amazing, and I thought about how I use a recording of Eric Satie, where every single recording of Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1 is playing at the same time. I don't know if you found this, but it's fascinating.
It's very Eric Satie of.
It kind of is, yes. That's in Theory 2, and that elicits some really interesting both reactions and discussions. It allows us to talk about the difference between engaging with something and liking it. It gives us all sorts of space for learning other things about music, or for engaging right away with the topic we're going to dive into for the day. So,
yeah, my contribution to this is, it kind of comes from an interesting event that happened at my institution. So we are a women's university, and we've been around for over 100 years. But south of us, just south of campus, is a park. It's a public park, and it's called Quakertown Park. And I always thought it was just a park. And I learned about 5 or 6 years ago that actually was a community of black people that had churches, there were businesses, there were shops, there was a school there, and they had settled about the turn of the century and were there until about 1920. And right around that time, or actually right around when women got the right to vote, which is also a really kind of an interesting twist that students are often shocked by, is that the town of Denton and our university, which was called College of Industrial Arts at the time, believed that community was a threat to the university, to all the women that were there. And so they actually voted to have all of the residents basically forcibly moved from Quakertown, which was their town, and they changed the name. They turned it into a public park and forced all of them out, and it has been a public park since then. And one way that the university has kind of been coming to terms with that is to try to educate more. And so members of our College of Arts and Sciences received an NEH grant a number of years ago to implement these kind of Quakertown stories into any and all classes. And so I volunteered a Theory 4 class as a class to engage with that topic. And so we visit the park, we look at archives, we look at photographs, we read letters and things like that. And students, as we go along in that fourth semester, have to write a composition based off of the Quakertown stories. And so that brings in a lot of interesting conversations about appropriation, your own placement, because depending on who you are, how do you write about something, right, that you have no idea how that would feel, or you might become from like the oppressor's perspective. And one way that we have kind of also developed that through the semester was listening to more contemporary music that were often had kind of social justice or social concern connections. And so listening to music like, shout out a couple pieces like Seven Last Words of the Unarmed by Joel Thompson, which is a really powerful piece which takes kind of the genre of the Seven Last Words of Christ, but instead of the Seven Last Words of Christ, takes the seven last phrases of 7 black men who were killed by either police or gun violence. Very powerful piece for men's choir, and pieces like Mother of a Revolution by Omar Thomas, which is a band piece about the Stonewall Uprising, and Marsha Johnson, who was a transgender woman who kind of was an important figure then, in showing how contemporary music can engage with these social issues and kind of letting them see how art music isn't just this sterile thing, that it can actually speak powerfully to our current events. And so that's one way that I've been kind of expanding things out that supports that Quakertown story. Well, another topic that has been very common for us has been oral skills.
Oral skills.
And so, Jen, you're going to lead us off with this one.
Yes, and the first thing I want to say is that the podcast, it's like been the greatest joy to get to talk about oral skills pedagogy, because it is one of my favorite things to teach, if not my favorite thing to teach. It's how I started. It's probably how a lot of us started as teaching assistants and teaching fellows. Oftentimes oral skills are given to the graduate students to deal with, right? But from the very first day of Oral Skills 1, I have loved it. And it's something that doesn't come up that much at theory conferences. I think that it's been only in the last few years that I've seen it regularly talked about, other than at this conference. But at, S&T or our local SMT, those kinds of events, it comes up less often. So it's been a real joy to talk about it with our guests. And actually, the reason that I led off in this one is because of our conversations with our guests, and because of the music theory pedagogy workshops in Vancouver this summer. I actually overhauled our entire oral skills curriculum, and we do things so much differently now than we did a year ago. I've included a lot more improvisation. I had actually taken performance. I had prioritized sight reading over performance for a long time, and I have put performance back in, and now we work on reading everything that's there, not just prioritizing pitch and rhythm. I'll say improvisation again because it's been one of the best adds of this year. I've added other elements of performance, like play and sing quizzes where they can use a guitar or a keyboard, and then they have to sing at the same time, which works on elements of being able to keep a steady tempo, being able to communicate, doing more than one thing at a time, which is just also a completely practical skill that almost every music career requires. I have done away with giving them any prompts for dictation. So when they take melodic dictation, for example, what they have is a blank staff, and I say there are 3 flats in the key signature. I don't count them in, I don't give them do, I don't tell them if it's major or minor, I give them nothing. And Gary Karpinski is the one who convinced me to do this, and I felt all kinds of fear and trepidation, and it was one of the best changes I ever made. I can tell you that by the end of Oral Skills 2 this last year, they were the strongest dictation students I've ever taught in my entire career. And on day 1, they were about the same as most every other student I'd ever taught in my career. So what it did, and I could see it happening live, was the goal of transcription and dictation is to be able to take a musical thing into your mind and manipulate it in your mind to make sense of it, and then give output in a way that someone else could read it. So when we want them to transcribe, we want them to, hear the information and turn it into something that can be read. But that requires this being able to sort of fast forward and rewind through it, finding the special moments, figuring out that part I remember was at the beginning or the middle or the end. That felt like a cadence. Where was that? What meter is this in? And, when they use transcription in their day-to-day musical lives, the piece of music does not tell them what do is, and the piece of music does not tell them what meter it's in. And so I've had to grapple too with other questions, like if a student writes a piece that's in 6/8 and 3/4, is that okay? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no. It was clearly in compound meter, and the student was just avoiding writing in compound meter. And other times it's like, well, the way they wrote it is a legitimate representation, and somebody would perform it completely accurately based on what they wrote down. So in the end, does it matter? It depends on the example. So I think the biggest thing that has come out of this is that this last year there has been so much joy. There's been so much joy because we're all doing so much music making, and the stakes have changed. It's not about getting a 100% right melodic dictation. We are excited when they can finally figure out that there's a pickup. That takes a shocking amount of time. I mean, like weeks. We worked on this, and these are great musicians, and they're starting every single thing on beat 1 and confused as to why it sounds weird. And I'm like, well, let's think about it, where is the emphasis? But, then when they finally got it and we could start to, really play around with that, how long is the pickup? Those sorts of things. There was so much excitement because they had discovered how to do it on their own, or we had discovered how to do it together. They're just listening to them. I'd have groups of students. I'd divide the class in half, and each half divided into 3, and one of them would be playing a progression at sight on a little keyboard. One of them would be sight singing a melody that goes with that progression, and then another student would have to improvise a harmony line over the melody. And then when they got to the end of the melody, they would swap so that, just rotate, and now you do the other thing. Now you're sight reading the keyboard. And there would be so much laughter and happiness and joy. And instead of saying, what did you do right or wrong, they're saying, I didn't like that I sang a third above the melody the whole time. I think if I did it again, I would try to incorporate other intervals or maybe some non-chord tones. So they're really thinking about what they're producing. And that made them joyous, and me too. So.
That was great. I don't have a ton to add to what Jen said, because she's done so many good things. It's hard to add on. So kudos again, Jen, to you and everything you've done. But I will say, those of you that went to our poster, you'll notice that we had several conversations, 7 in fact, people outside of music theory that are in different career paths as music professionals. And I listened back before the conference to all those episodes, and to come up with this kind of poster and everything, try to synthesize, was there a thread that went through all these people's reactions to what they're using in their music careers? It seemed to be error detection was the thing they were using. It didn't mean they were all using it in the same way, like here a 12-tone row, which one repeated,
That actually didn't come up, never happened actually.
That didn't come up,
A
believe
lot
it
of
or
guests
not.
don't want us to do that at all.
But in various forms, error detection came up across all of those conversations in different ways. So I began to think about how much error detection are we actually doing versus just straight dictation. It seems like straight dictation is the starting point. I don't know why, but trying to move towards, well, how do we apply, applied error detection, right? What am I listening for? Is it timbre? Is it intonation? Is it can I detect metering? Can I actually do all those things? And then also most of us are not hearing piano music all the day in our AirPods, right? We're hearing all different types of timbres, hearing all different types of things. So if we want to be more realistic, we're going to use less piano and encourage people to bring their own instrument in and play something for one another, or have, in my case, one of my TS, it's very typical to walk into one of my TS and starting off class with guitar, starting off class with flute, or bringing up a pre-made groove from a DAW and starting class with that. That's very commonplace now, and I don't think I would have seen that as much nearly 3 or 4 years ago, so that's maybe one additional thing.
Yeah, getting away from that piano, that's been a big change for me as well, like trying to get as many listening examples that are not the piano away from that. And I'm a pianist, so it's really hard for me because it's so easy just to walk over there and play it. But getting those different sounds for those students. And one thing I'll add is the timbre piece. I love bringing in electronic music into oral skills, listening for different waveforms, listening to different types of noise. Can you hear the difference between pink noise or white noise? Different waveforms. I try to identify them. You can't really sing waveforms. Maybe Jacob Collier could sing. I think he could probably. Yeah, he's like, oh, sawtooth. Well, maybe I have a choir of sawtooth waves maybe in the future. But bringing that in, using DAWs in oral skills, and if you want to go to the next slide there, I think I have a slide. Oh, there we go. So a tool that I've been using just within the past semester is this tool by Brian Jarvis, who he is a faculty member at UT El Paso, and he has a couple of amazing web-based programs. One is called Former, which is it's a way of creating forms. This is oral layer. And so how this works is it kind of looks actually kind of like a DAW. And so students create the different, basically kind of tracks. And the cool thing is that this syncs up with a YouTube video. So you get a link for the YouTube video.
And or an MP3. Or an MP3.
Or an MP3, yeah. You drop it into the web browser, and then as you're playing along, you can make marks for when you hear certain sounds. And so I should have put the sounds or the pieces on here, but you can see, like, on the right, you can see rhythm guitar, Vox, drum machine, fluttery synth, BGVs, lead, which took me a long time to realize that was background vocals, embarrassingly long time. Lead guitar, strings, higher drums, underwater effect, and descant. And so it's a way of visualizing the different timbres, the different layers that they're hearing, because oral skills is not just melody, harmony, rhythm. It's like being able to listen to a track and be able to decipher the type of instruments, the type of textures that you're hearing, or perhaps with that underwater effect, talk about, well, how did that happen? And then you can talk about filters or things like that, and how the frequencies can be manipulated through a low pass filter. And then on the left you have BGVs, wobbly pad. Sometimes we have to just make up terms for these sounds. Distorted guitar, a whoosh, synth, keyboard, drums, vocals, TV static. And then we can think about, well, what's the difference between a whoosh and a suspended cymbal or something like that? And they're basically the same thing.
I heard 2 students outside my office door after I gave a project like this to a group project. I heard 2 students arguing for about 15 minutes outside my office about whether trumpet and trombone needed to be separate lines or whether they could be together, because they always only played together, but they weren't playing the same notes, but they always sound at the same time. So it's one layer, but those are the kind of conversations we want them to be having and be engaging in. And my students told me they loved this project more than almost anything else we had done. So
yeah, and just being able to hear these instruments, because it's surprising how many students don't know what these instruments sound like. They've heard them for their lives, but what is that, a horn or is that a trombone? And these types of distinctions.
Or I gave an assignment this was early with these students this year, where they had to identify instruments, and it was a bass clarinet, and multiple students wrote either flute or trumpet. So I was very concerned, but clearly they have grown.
And then our last topic has been curriculum goals, more than just lesson plans and syllabi. And this, of course, has been a common theme in this whole conference. And so many of us have taken some pretty meaningful steps in changing our curriculum based off our conversations.
As I mentioned before, I teach at a school that is largely music therapy. We have a big music therapy program, and then music ed, and then a few liberal arts performance majors. But the music therapy program is our kind of bread and butter and what makes us kind of unique in that area. And so talking to the therapy faculty about what those students need, and I came in to DW knowing nothing about music therapy at all. I had no clue what music therapy was about, and so it's really an incredible program. It's an incredible profession. You're using music. It's not just singing some songs to make you feel happy. It's using music for outcomes that are related to well-being and things like that, measurable outcomes with music. And learning that these students really had to be the best music students in the whole music building, because they had to sing, they had to play multiple things: percussion, keyboard, guitar. They had to improvise, they had to compose right off the cuff, and they had to do that in a NICU ward or in a hospice setting, or with doctors or nurses going around. So they had to be so well trained that they could operate in these sometimes stressful or unusual situations that we're not normally thinking about making music in those settings. And so I kind of have revamped my second semester Theory and Oral Skills to include a lot of pop music. Actually, as I was making these changes, the Glendenning Marvin 4th edition came out, and you have that big chapter of popular music. I was like, all right, this works out for me. That was huge. That helped a lot in bringing those things in, and also just composing and improvising. We compose all the time. We have composition projects that we do, but we also do just a lot of in-class composing, and my background as a composer kind of helps with those things. And I've learned that if you can kind of set the parameters pretty tight, they can do a lot of things. We had a presentation earlier on improvisation that had a similar theme, where if you can keep these topics and the instructions pretty closed, students are very comfortable. So I have a minimalist composition project that we do in class, where we listen to piano phase and clapping music, some Steve Reich and things like that, and then they're given 2 staves, and the bottom stave goes like something like this, all right, and that repeats for 12 blocks, and then the top part, they're instructed to start with that same line, and then they have to change a maximum of 2 parameters with each iteration. So maybe the right hand goes, getting rid of that third or something like that. And then the next measure, they can change up to 2 more parameters. And so by the end, so maybe like that 12th iteration, it's become something totally different. Sometimes students will change and get to the 6th iteration, and then they'll do the process in inverse, so they get back to the original. I've had students change it so much that it's like totally unrecognizable. This last time, I think they gradually made all the notes longer and longer until like each note was a whole note, and so you had this da 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 da, and like you had a whole note C and then a whole note G, and then we play them at the end of class. So I'll have a pianist come and they'll play the left hand part, and I'll kind of sight read through, or if we have a really good pianist, they'll play the other part so they can hear it. And that's the other piece that's super important, is that they hear these compositions. I do stuff with indeterminacy, where we'll talk about like Mozart dice games. And we'll do short little exercises where I'll give them 6 measures of rhythm, and they have 8 bars, and they have a dice. Some of them bring in I had a student bring in their like 24-sided dice one time, and they'll roll the dice, and for each number there's a different measure number for rhythm, and so they'll do each measure rhythm, and then they'll do the same thing for however number of rhythmic events are there for pitch, and then I usually pick some type of pretty standard like C pentatonic or something like that. So it will sound good. It'll sound like C major or maybe A Aeolian, and then we sing them at the end, and they're quite surprised how using these chant procedures created something that was quite pleasing. And so a lot of composition, especially as we get into concepts that are a little more abstract for them, 20th century, 21st century techniques is really helpful. And then a lot of improvisation. We do a lot of that. I have a little video just a little fun example. So I think if you go to the next one. All right, so this is, don't click on it just yet, but I use a lot of 4-bar loops or or 4 chord loops as prompts for improvisation. They'll do them by themselves. We'll do them in class. So this was like a sing-off. So I put them like in 2 different groups. And I think this 4 chord loop was something that came from a song that one of them brought in. And so we figured out the changes, and then as little choirs, they had to then figure out how they're going to sing this loop, right? So they had to figure out the parts, the voice leading, and then they had to kind of assign 1 or 2 folks to improvise over it. Someone brought their violin that day, so they were playing with it. So this is just them going crazy at the end. They just all were going. I think someone has a shaker that they had. Someone always has a shaker in there. So this is like just at the end. It was just a fun time. You bring up that joy aspect.
Yes.
Like, it's just a good time. So you can start that off. I don't know how loud it is. Oh, we might need to bring up the volume. Go. All right. It was fun. All right. And they get comfortable, as you mentioned before. The more you do it, the more comfortable they get. And it's just really fun. That music making aspect is really critical. So those are a few things that I have done. What would I do next?
I guess me, because Ben handed me the microphone. So the first thing I want to say is that when you look at changing your curriculum, it feels incredibly daunting. Just changing your textbook can feel incredibly daunting. You feel like you're starting over. You already know how to grade worksheet 2 point whatever, and now you have to learn how to grade a new one. And so what has been the most effective for me is really taking a small teaching approach. It's not to say I haven't ever just completely overhauled something. I just described overhauling oral skills, but when it comes to where we are now compared to what our theory curriculum looked like when I started at my job full-time 11 years ago, it's night and day. But most of those changes were 1 lesson plan, 1 musical example at a time. And I think the incredible privilege of doing this podcast is that we get constant inspiration from you. So our guests help us innovate and reinvent, and that's been probably one of the greatest things about teaching the last 4 years, is taking all these ideas and being able to extract just one thing I can do differently or better tomorrow. And that ends up making a load of difference in the long run. One example of a small teaching change I made, actually because we read Phil Yule's book as sort of a book club last summer, and I had all of these like specifically keyboard quizzes built into my theory class where they had to, play scales or chords, the things we have them do on the keyboard. And I changed it so that they could complete those quizzes on any instrument. They could use guitar. If they had a trombone, by chance, they could do that. They just had to complete portions where they had to name notes a different way. They could even sing them if they wanted. No students sang them, but I did get a lot of students who said, "Thank you for letting me use my guitar." Because I have so many industry students, a lot of my students, their first instrument is guitar, and that's the one where they feel most comfortable. So they can absolutely spell every chord in a key for me on their guitar, that's no problem, but the keyboard feels like such a challenging hurdle for them. So I just had great results, and it was one tiny change that literally made no difference to me or how I graded or my rubric or anything like that at all. So small teaching, big advocate.
Curricular changes at UNT, I'm really happy to talk about some of these, and some of them are undergraduate, some of them are graduate. So at the undergraduate level, I will say that Sonata Form got the axe. And we do teach a 32-bar AABA. I've got a lot more composition projects. That's definitely a result of the podcast. I think maybe 3 years ago I would do a composition project at the end of the first year, a composition project in the second year, which is great, it's better than 0. But it's certainly not what I'm doing now, which is weaving composition throughout, doing many compositional activities with peers, where they share things, where they think about the character, think about how they want to express certain things, and then fill in how are you putting your timbre together, How are you putting your rhythm and meter together? How are you putting your melodic lines? What are the components that you want to focus on to portray this character that you want to talk about? But the biggest thing that we've done at the undergraduate level is integrate with jazz studies. So we fused, my colleague Jillian Robertson and I fused our Theory 1 and 2 with jazz fundamentals. It got rid of this separation between jazz majors taking the jazz fundamentals course and then also having to take music theory 1 and 2. I thought that's just so redundant, right? Why would we not just take the opportunity to integrate? So we had a lot of meetings, had a lot of Zoom calls, thought about things we could take out or displace in different places, and we ended up integrating theory 1 and 2 fully with jazz studies. So I think that was a really good step in the right direction, at least from my perspective. And then at the graduate level, a couple of things that we've done is to make world music analysis a required course. And that had its own ramifications. So for example, we trimmed down history of theory. Right? History of theory is now just a 2-semester sequence, world music analysis required. And then also adjusting language requirements. Language requirements, a lot of times were very, very Eurocentric in several schools. So we were able to dismantle that in a really, I think healthy way that speaks to a curricular goal, I think, too.
Well, we really didn't work in an editing for this
We
presentation.
didn't. Normally we record that later.
Yeah.
So we say goodbye to our guest and we have a wonderful chat with them, and every single time we're always like, this was so much fun, because it's always true. And then they get off the call and we record their bio and other things.
Yeah.
And that's how we end. So today what I will say is, to anyone there's a few people in here who have been willing to be guests on the podcast, and we are incredibly grateful to you because we have learned so much from you. And to those of you who listen, thank you so much. We appreciate that too. And we're just so glad to be a part of this pedagogy community. Thanks.
You just made it to the end of another episode of Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the podcast, and you can always reach us at notedoctorspodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or show ideas. Thanks for listening.